Hello, welcome to Business Research Methods, ECO-595. In this lecture, we will be going over Chapter 13 in the textbook, Measurement and Scaling Concepts. All right, so in business research, usually we need to measure something. The variables involved in the hypothesis needs to be measured. Then we will be able to collect the data needed to test the hypothesis. But how do we measure? Let's take a look at the example here. Money matters. Okay. Suppose we have a guy called Griff Michel. Is the vice president of a consumer relationship management for one of the world's largest suppliers of industrial heavy equipment. So basically, Griff is the vice president of CRM, customer relationship management. Okay. Right now, the company is considering evaluating all CRM employees. Okay. And they want an overall ranking of all CRM employees. Basically, the company's intention is to identify the lowest 20% of performers, and then they will put these employees on the probationary list with specified targeted improvement goals. And then they will meet a year later to evaluate these employees again to determine whether they have improved or not. Okay. Probably this sounds quite familiar. I believe a lot of big companies are now doing this as well. I often heard from my friends about such practice in large companies, and honestly, it feels somewhat cruel to me. At least in the job I have right now, we also evaluate people. We also set specific goals for certain employees, but we don't have this very specific outline saying that the lowest 20% will be fired. So anyway, now the key question for Griff is, how could he measure performance? How could he come up with the overall ranking? First of all, he needs to measure performance. And then based on the score, he will be able to rank order the employees. But how do you measure performance, right? If you think about it, performance cannot be perfectly measured, I have to say. There's no perfect measurement for performance, okay? And actually, during senior CRM managers meeting, a few managers come up with several suggestions here. They say it could be sales, right? We're gonna look at the sales of each CRM to determine whether the performance is good or not. Or it could be the director's evaluation, right? The director knows the employee the best. He will be able to tell whether this is a good one, that is a medium one, or that employee is the bottom, 20%. Well, but after all, CRM employees are interacting with customers, right? So maybe they should evaluate it based on customer satisfaction. And then again, the bottom line is the CRM employees work to increase the company's sales and profits. So it could be profit, or it could be all of these, right? So apparently this could be a topic for business research. That is to find out the most valid and reliable measure for performance. Actually, one thing the company could do is to initiate a research project, hire an expert, and consider all different measures or different variables to measure performance, put it together, and also consult what other companies are doing, and then eventually come up with the best measurement of performance specifically designed for this particular company. Okay, so when measuring performance, there might be a general guideline that applies to all situations, but then specifically for each company, such measurement could change, the weight could change for each individual variables. Now let's talk about measurement. Okay, the first question when you try to define measurement is, what do you want to measure? Okay, so measurement is the process of describing some property of a phenomenon, usually by assigning numbers in a reliable and valid way. Now, of course, the numbers should convey information about the property being measured. Sometimes measurement is easy to come up with if you have a very specific goal. If you're talking about sales, improving company sales, then the measurement will be the number reflecting in sales. That's direct and easy to measure. Sometimes, if you are talking about consumer satisfaction, that's a different story. If you're talking about consumer satisfaction, you could be talking about satisfaction about the product pricing, the product quality, about customer service, etc. Okay, so that, if you think about it, could potentially be a weighted overall measurement, which is sometimes we call an index. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Right. So another example here. The measurement sometimes can be rough, sometimes can be subtle, and it really depends on the purpose of the research. Okay, for example, when we talk about course grade, right? In the US, usually we will be looking at letter grade eventually, even though during the semester, I believe most of us professors will measure your performance based on a percentage scale, right? We have a percentage, and eventually we'll say we're going to convert 90 to 100% to A, 80 to 89% to B, etc., right? So we're going to eventually, by the end of the semester, convert it to letter grade. But what's the problem with that? Well, as a student, you must know this very well, right? What if you fall at the border, right? What if your score is at the end? Well, then it really depends on the situation and the professor, right? Some professor will be willing to curve if you are very close to the next level. Like for the first person, 79.9%. I will definitely curve it to B. Some professor, let me tell you, I do know a few colleagues while working that they will not curve at all. They will not curve. Even if you get 79.99, that's still C. Well, I can understand the logic, but probably sometimes students won't. Now, the reasoning is, look, over the whole semester, you are earning not just 1%, 100%. It's sometimes 500 points, okay? So when we convert it to percentage and then to letter grade, 0.1% is not equivalent to 1 point. It could be equivalent to 5 points sometimes. And that is equivalent to maybe 1 or 2 multiple choice questions in the exam. Okay, so their logic is you get what you earn, and they will not curve. Now for the second person, look at this poor guy, 79.4%. Most of the time, when we round numbers, right? We round if it's above 0.5. So 79.4% probably will not curve to a B. So this guy got a C. But what's the difference between these two? The winner and the, I wouldn't call it the loser, but the unfortunate person, right? Only 5% difference. And look at the letter grade. When we convert to letter grade, that's a big difference. In particular, if we're talking about calculating GPA, right? That will make a big difference. All right. So that's the problem, or that's the potential problem with assigning letter grade to course grade. That is, we actually have to sacrifice the subtle measurement. We have to sacrifice these details for a much larger scale. All right. Now, I came from China, so actually in China, we have been using percentage grade all the time. So we are using 100% as what you guys do here before converting to letter grade. And we'll also define grades higher than 60% to be passing grade. 100% is perfect. And below 60%, that means you're failing the course. But eventually, in our transcript, we actually record the actual percentage instead of the letter grade. And then eventually, we're going to calculate an average of all percentage grades to use it as an overall grade. Nowadays, actually, I noticed some schools started using letter grade instead of the percentage grades as the final reporting grade. I don't know the reason they're doing this, but maybe they're trying to make it easy for students to convert to GPA when applying to universities in the US. That's one potential reason I could think of. There's also this PF grade, passing versus fail grade, right? Now you would notice if there are this PF grades, it's usually assigned to courses that are not extremely important. I wouldn't say they're not important. They are really important, I guess, diversified course for a student to take. But for example, if you are not here, I guess, for your MBA degree, but there are other master's degree that will give you option to write thesis instead of taking certain courses. If you're writing a thesis, you're gonna need to register for course specifically designed for students who are writing thesis, so that you are still maintaining your full-time student status. Okay, and for those courses, guess what? Your professor will not assign a letter grade. You will only get POF, passing or fail. And well, actually, most of the time, a student will get a passing mark for thesis, because as long as you are making progress, as long as you are writing thesis, you are passing the course. So passing fail grades are usually used to assign courses like thesis writing or PE courses, etc. Okay. So with this example, what I want to illustrate is the measurements. It depends on what's the purpose of the research. Sometimes you want the measurement to be subtle, so you want to keep the very much detailed information. Sometimes, if this is a general question, if this is more related to a general opinion in social science, then most of the time we will skip some of the information and go with rough measurement. Okay, and there are 4 levels of measurement actually, depending, again, as I said, depending on the situation and also depending on how detailed you want to be. The first level is, which is also the lowest level, is called the nominal level. Sometimes we also call this categorical, okay, because it includes categories only. And we assign the value to an object for identification or classification purposes only, okay? That is, we do not try to quantify the object. And apparently, you're going to have categories in this level of measurement. For example, we have, if we're talking about sweeteners, it could be cane sugar, it could be corn syrup, it could be fruit extract, right? If you think about these 3 categories, right? They're different categories, but they don't have any, you don't have a way to rank order them, right? You can't say one is better than the other or one is better than the other. So basically, this is the lowest level. You only care about their characteristics or their classification. The next level is called ordinal. The difference between ordinal and nominal is, as you can tell from the words, for ordinal level, you can rank order the categories. Okay, so for ordinal level, it allows things to be ranked based on certain property. okay? And for example, we talk about surveys. And in the surveys, you also often ask a question such as, how do you evaluate the service? It could be from the worst, bad, okay, good, very good. So these are categories, right? And at the same time, you can also rank order them from the lowest to the highest. And we call such level measurements ordinal level measurements, okay? The next level will be more subtle. We're gonna look at interval level. For interval level, we can capture information about differences in quantities of a concept, okay? So basically, when we talk about interval level of measurement, we are looking at real numbers, okay? If we talk about weight, okay, then we could also talk about the difference between two wage levels. We could be talking about the total wages. Now, for the ordinal and nominal, it doesn't make sense when you add up two categories, okay? You cannot add very well, very good, and good together. That doesn't make sense. Well, but pay attention, I'm not talking about adding the number of respondents to these categories together. I'm talking about just adding these two categories. That wouldn't make sense, right? But for interval data, you can do a lot of calculation. You can do summation, you can do subtraction, multiplication, division, etc. Okay? And of course, interval data will have both nominal and ordinal properties because you could classify interval data. But basically, you're going to define several intervals, several ranges within the data scale. And you can also rank order them, of course. Most of the time, the more the better, okay? Here's one example of interval data, temperature, okay? We could say June the 6th, the temperature is 80 Fahrenheit. December the 7th, temperature is 40 Fahrenheit, okay? Now, attitude is also a level, interval level. The highest level is ratio level, okay? There's just one little difference between ratio level and interval level. For ratio level data, we also see real numbers. We can also do a lot of calculation, okay? Now, the difference between ratio and interval is that for ratio level, okay, here's the big difference. 0 means the absence of some property, okay? So whenever you try to judge whether this is interval or ratio, ask, does 0 mean anything? Okay, look at temperature, 0 Fahrenheit. Does it mean anything? Does it mean the absence of some property? Okay, now we use temperature to kind of measure how warm or how cold the weather is, right? But 0 doesn't mean it's absence of cold or warm, right? 0 doesn't mean it's absence of temperature. 0 is just one scale among all the different levels, okay? So in that sense, temperature cannot be ratio data. Now, example of ratio level measurement could be weight, right? 0 means the absence of any money. 0 means the absence of any income. So 0 in that sense has a meaning, okay? And then we call that ratio level data, okay? Now, actually, whether a researcher would like to differentiate between interval and ratio, it really depends on the situation. Sometimes we could combine these two if our research purpose allows us to do so. If we don't really care about this 0 absence of some property thing, we could just combine interval and ratio together. I've also seen textbooks that just mention interval data and skip ratio because there's just little difference between these two measures. Furthermore, we can also differentiate different measurements depending on whether discrete or continuous. Okay, so the discrete measures means measures that can only take one of a finite number of values. Apparently, nominal and ordinal scales will be discrete measures because they're categories. Like continuous measures are measures that can take on any value along some scale range. Okay, basically that means there's an infinite number of values. Most of the time, interval and ratio scale are considered to be continuous measures. There are exceptions though, although I put interval and ratio scale here, there are exceptions. If we're talking about, for example, family members, right? They take integers only, right? And I can't imagine if a family has 1,000 members in it. And therefore, we'll say, actually, in that case, interval scale and ratio scale are discrete measures because it takes integers only. Okay. And finally, I would like to talk about index measures. There are situations when you cannot measure some property using one variable, and you have to combine several variables to better measure something. The example we had at the beginning when we talk about measuring performance, right? And there are several options up there: the sales, profits, director's opinion. The last one is customer satisfaction, right? Actually, for that case, it is better to design an index measure that combines all of these different aspects together. And in addition, for index measures, we may also assign different weights depending on the importance of each variable. Okay, here's another example. Actually, there's something called American Consumer Satisfaction Index. I'm not sure whether you are aware of this now, but basically what they do is they create a weighted average of 3 questions that measure different facts of satisfaction with the product or service. So basically they survey customers and ask them to evaluate their satisfaction based on 3 aspects: their perceived quality, consumer expectations, and perceived value. And after that, they give different weight to these 3 aspects. Then they calculate this index to kind of measure how satisfied a consumer is with a particular product or a particular brand. Lastly, let's talk about what are good measurements. Okay, so we basically look at 3 aspects. We want a good measurement to be reliable, be valid, and sensitive. Okay, we're gonna go through these criteria very briefly. The textbook gives more details as to how you're gonna track whether the data or the measurement is reliable. But we're gonna just look at the concept of these 3 criteria. So the first one is reliability. Okay. Reliability refers to the degree to which measures are free from random error and therefore yield consistent results. Okay. The key word here is really consistent. Okay. That is, the measurement will be the same even if we try to evaluate the subject from different ways. Okay. And this is actually why sometimes you answer a survey questionnaire and you find a same topic were asked twice. Okay. And you were like, why are they repeating this? Actually, sometimes they use repeated question, not exactly the same, but similar, right? They use repeated question to double check whether this customer or this respondent is telling the truth or not. Okay, if they find any inconsistency, then they probably exclude this questionnaire, this survey, because it's not consistent. So the other criteria is validity. Okay, we want the measurement to be valid. Right. And in terms of validity, it's the accuracy of a measure or the extent to which a score truthfully represents a concept. Okay? Basically, when we check for validity, we ask, does a scale measure what was intended to be measured? Are you measuring what you really want to measure? So, for example, if we are talking about the measurement of performance, right? And if we include the supervisor's opinion or the supervisor's evaluation, if a supervisor is assigning evaluation not purely based on the perceived performance, but also based on the friendship, then in that case, actually that measurement is not valid because it's biased. Okay. Now, another example, just quickly, is say that we have a police officer, right, measuring the car speed, and he's using the radar gun and find that a car is driving at 83 miles per hour on the 55 highway, right? So apparently this car is speeding. But then, okay, if the officer used the same radar and measure the house, right, and find the house to be moving at 28, what do you think? Now, apparently, this measurement is not valid because the radar gun is not doing the job. The house cannot move. So basically, the speed for the house should be 0, and apparently, the speed for that speeding car should be much lower. So that's an example where we find the measurement to be not valid. The last one is sensitivity. Sensitivity is really reflect whether the measurement instruments can accurately measure variability. Okay, that is, if a subtle change had occurred in the environment, would the measurement pick up that? Okay. Again, let's talk about the survey question, right? You may find out that certain surveys will ask you to evaluate customer service based on the following scales, and sometimes they provide 5, sometimes provide 10, and sometimes they just ask yes or no question or agree or disagree question, right? Now, apparently, if a survey question is asking about agree or disagree, that's the least sensitive measurement because you leave out a lot of in-between opinions. What if I am somewhat agree? What if I slightly disagree, right? So a more sensitive one will be, of course, you include more levels. You could say total disagree, and then disagree, slightly disagree, neutral, and then counting from there, okay? But then a question may be, why, if you're saying that agree and or disagree type of research survey question is not sensitive, but why people are still using it? Well, there are reasons and situations that you could use it. For example, if you are designing a lot of questions in a survey, providing a very subtle level will kind of get the respondent get tired and bored with the question. And sometimes, if this is a question that is not crucial, okay, and you do not really need the subtle opinion from your respondents, you could use this yes or no answer, right? So that's all we want to say about chapter 13. It's a short chapter just to kind of let you be aware of measurement issues, all right? I'll see you next time.